Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore some of the most intense and, frankly, brutal leadership lessons ever recorded, drawn from the life of a man who was born a slave, raised a prince, became a fugitive, and ended up a prophet responsible for millions of people in the middle of a desert. Picture an old man, his back bent not just by 120 years, but by the unimaginable weight of an entire nation's hopes, fears, and constant complaints. He's standing on a mountain, gazing across a valley at a beautiful, fertile land, a land he has spent the last 40 years of his life leading his people toward, but a land he himself will never be allowed to set foot in. That man is Moses, and his story is a masterclass in leadership under pressure, so extreme it's almost beyond our comprehension. Most leaders, handed the job description Moses had, would have quit, had a breakdown, or been stoned by their own people within the first week. Frankly, you probably wouldn't survive it either. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. Let me know in the comments your city and what time it is for you right now. To truly understand the first brutal lesson of Moses' leadership journey, you have to understand the world that made him, a world of staggering contradiction. It was a world defined by the slow, eternal pulse of the Nile River. In the royal city of Pharaoh, the river meant life, abundance, and divine order. Its predictable floods brought rich, black silt that nourished the fields, guaranteeing harvests of barley and emmer wheat. Along its banks, magnificent temples of limestone and granite reached for the sun, their walls covered in intricate hieroglyphs telling stories of gods and glorious pharaohs. The air in the palace circles was thick with the scent of lotus blossoms, expensive incense, and roasting meats. Music from harps and lutes drifted through colonnaded halls, where courtiers in fine white linen and elaborate jewelry schemed and flattered. This was a world of power, of knowledge, of supreme confidence. It was the world of Egypt, the greatest empire on earth. And in the heart of this world, a young man named Moses was being raised as a prince, the adopted son of Pharaoh's own daughter. He learned to read the complex symbols that held the secrets of their gods and history. He studied mathematics, learning the sacred geometry that allowed them to build pyramids that seemed to touch the heavens. He was trained in military strategy, understanding how to command chariots and archers, how to fortify a city, and how to crush an enemy. His tutors were the finest minds in the kingdom, and they filled his head with Egyptian philosophy, the concept of mad, divine order, truth, and justice, and the unquestionable divinity of Pharaoh himself. He learned that problems had solutions, and that the solutions were found through strength, intelligence, and the application of Egyptian power. He was being sculpted, piece by piece, into a leader of Egypt. He walked like a prince, he talked like a prince, and he thought like a prince. But a few miles away, in the province of Goshen, the same Nile River told a very different story. There, The river's mud wasn't for nourishing crops, it was for making bricks. And it was made by his people, the Hebrews. For them, the air wasn't filled with incense and music. It was thick with the dust of the brickyards, the stench of sweat, and the constant, soul-crushing sound of whips cracking. Their world was not one of power and confidence, but of slavery and sorrow. They were a nation of builders who owned nothing, a people whose every waking moment was dictated by the whims of Egyptian taskmasters. Their backs were scarred from the lash, their hands were raw from the clay, and their spirits were being ground into the very mud they dwelled in. Every day, they were forced to build the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramesses, monuments to the glory of the empire that was slowly killing them. And this is the first fundamental contradiction that defined Moses. He had the mind of an Egyptian prince, but the blood of a Hebrew slave. We don't know exactly when or how he learned the truth of his birth. The Bible simply says that his mother, Jochebed, hid him in a basket in the reeds of the Nile to save him from Pharaoh's decree that all Hebrew baby boys be killed. And it was Pharaoh's daughter who found him, and through a stroke of divine irony, hired his own mother to be his wet nurse. Perhaps Jochebed whispered the secret to him in his earliest years, planting a seed of identity that would lie dormant for decades. Or perhaps it was an open secret in the palace, a source of court gossip, a subtle taunt used by a rival prince. Remember where you came from, they might have sneered, a reminder that for all his fine linen and education, he was still one of them. Imagine the psychological torment of this dual existence. In the palace, he was royalty. He commanded respect. He had a future of influence and authority laid out before him. But every time he saw a line of Hebrew slaves shuffling past, their eyes downcast, their bodies thin from overwork and undernourishment, what did he feel? A pang of guilt, a surge of shame, a flicker of connection. He was living in the very house, eating from the very table that was paid for by their suffering. He was a living embodiment of the system that oppressed his own people. Every luxury he enjoyed was a testament to their misery. This internal conflict must have been a slow-burning fire. For 40 years, he lived this life. 40 years of watching, learning, and wrestling with a question that every great leader must eventually face. Who am I? Am I the sum of my circumstances, the product of my palatial upbringing? Or am I defined by something deeper, by my blood, my heritage, my people? For 40 years, the Prince of Egypt seemed to be winning. He likely pushed the thoughts down, focused on his duties, and enjoyed the immense privileges of his station. It's easy to ignore a problem when your life is comfortable. It's easy to rationalize injustice when you are on the benefiting side of it. He might have told himself that he could do more good for them from the inside, that one day, when he had more power, he would implement reforms and ease their burden. It's a classic justification of the privileged and the powerful. I'll fix the broken system from within. Just wait. But a day came when waiting was no longer an option. The biblical text says simply, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. This wasn't just a casual stroll. The language suggests a deliberate act, a decision. After 40 years, the fire inside him had finally reached a flashpoint. He could no longer stay within the pristine, sanitized walls of the palace. He had to see. He had to confront the reality he had been avoiding. So he leaves the polished marble floors and enters the world of the mud pits. The change in atmosphere would have been a physical shock. The oppressive heat, magnified by the kilns firing millions of bricks. The air so thick with dust you could taste it. The relentless, monotonous rhythm of labor. Dig the clay, mix the straw, press it into the mold, haul the heavy bricks, day after day after day. And above it all, the shouting of the taskmasters, their voices dripping with contempt. For a man accustomed to the quiet dignity of the court, this was a vision of hell. And then he saw it. An Egyptian taskmaster beating one of his kinsmen, a Hebrew slave. This wasn't a distant, abstract injustice he could ponder in a palace library. This was real. It was visceral. The crack of the whip wasn't just a sound. It was the sound of his people's suffering made flesh. The cry of the slave wasn't just a noise. It was a voice that echoed the silent screams in his own soul. In that moment, the 40 years of internal conflict erupted. The Egyptian prince and the Hebrew slave within him went to war. And for the first time, the Hebrew slave won. His education, his training in strategy and statecraft, all of it vanished. All the years of learning about mad, divine order and justice were incinerated by a sudden, white-hot rage. He didn't formulate a plan. He didn't consider the consequences. He didn't think about the political ramifications. The text says he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Let's break that down, because this is the first brutal leadership lesson. This is where the prince's plan for misguided justice is born and dies in a single, catastrophic moment. First, he looked this way and that. This is the telltale sign of a man acting from his own strength and his own conscience, not from a divine calling. He wasn't looking up for guidance. He was looking around for witnesses. His primary concern was not what was right, but what he could get away with. This is the logic of a man who believes he is in control. A true leader, one acting on a mission larger than himself, is less concerned with who is watching and more concerned with whether the action itself is right, just, and wise. Moses was performing a risk assessment based on his own limited perspective. He made a calculation. No witnesses, no consequences. He was wrong. Second, he struck down the Egyptian. He used the one tool he had been trained to use his entire life, force. As an Egyptian prince, he was part of a system that solved problems through power, domination, and violence. When faced with a problem of injustice, he defaulted to his training. He didn't try to de-escalate. He didn't use his royal status to intervene and command the taskmaster to stop. He didn't report the abuse to a higher authority. He met violence with greater violence. He became the very thing he hated. He saw an oppressor, and in his rage to stop him, became a killer. He tried to solve a systemic problem of slavery with a single act of personal vengeance. This is a critical failure point for so many aspiring leaders. They have a passion for justice, a genuine desire to right wrongs, but their methods are shaped by the very systems they wish to oppose. They see a nail, and their only tool is a hammer. Moses saw an injustice, and his only tool in that moment of rage was the lethal force of a prince. He thought he was acting as a savior, but he was acting as an assassin. Third, and hid him in the sand, the cover-up. The immediate aftermath of the act was not a feeling of righteous victory, but of fear and panic. If his action had been truly just, truly from a place of righteous authority, why the need to hide it? Hiding the body is an admission of guilt. It's an admission that he knew he had transgressed a law, whether it was God's or Pharaoh's. He had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner, and now he had to hide the evidence. This act of burying the body is symbolic. He was trying to bury his crime, to bury his rage, to bury the part of him that had just erupted. He was trying to go back to being the prince, to pretend it never happened. But you can't bury your character. You can't hide your failures in the sand and expect them to stay hidden. The truth, like a body, has a way of coming to the surface. So Moses goes home that night, his fine linen robes perhaps stained with a bit of blood and sand. His hands, usually busy with scrolls and scepters, are now the hands of a murderer. How did he sleep that night? Did the face of the dead Egyptian haunt him? Or did he feel a grim satisfaction, a sense that he had finally done something? He probably felt a mix of both, the adrenaline of taking action and the gnawing fear of being discovered. He likely told himself it was a necessary evil, a first strike for freedom. He had shown his people he was on their side. He had drawn a line in the sand, literally. He was ready to lead. He thought this was the beginning of the revolution. He was tragically mistaken. This is where the lesson becomes truly brutal. The very next day, Moses goes out again, filled with a new sense of purpose. He sees himself differently now. He's no longer just a conflicted prince. He's a secret agent of liberation, a defender of his people. He's proven his loyalty with blood. So when he sees two Hebrews fighting with each other, he sees his next leadership opportunity. It's a natural next step. He handled an external enemy yesterday. Today, he will handle internal division. This is what leaders do, right? They solve problems. They bring order. He approaches the one in the wrong and says, with all the authority he can muster, "Why are you striking your companion?" It's a reasonable question from a leader. He is attempting to mediate, to bring peace, to apply his sense of justice to his own people. He expects them to see him as their champion, their protector. He expects them to listen. The man's reply is one of the most devastating lines in the entire story. It is the iceberg that sinks Moses' entire self-conception. The man shoves him aside and sneers, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Let that sink in. The sheer brutality of that response. First, who made you a prince and a judge over us? In one sentence, his own people completely reject his authority. They throw his princely status back in his face, not as a source of power, but as a source of suspicion. You're one of them, they're implying. You swan in here from your palace, with your soft hands and your fancy clothes, and you think you can tell us how to live. They don't see him as one of them. They see him as an outsider, an Egyptian-raised aristocrat playing at being a Hebrew. He had no credibility. He had no relationship with them. He had just shown up and expected to be in charge, and they call him out on it. Leadership isn't a title you can claim. It's a trust you must earn. Moses had done nothing to earn their trust. His one great act of liberation was a secret. And in the absence of a relationship, his attempt to mediate was seen as an arrogant intrusion. Second, and far more terrifying for Moses, are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? It wasn't a secret. His great, clandestine act of rebellion was already common knowledge in the slave pits. The very people he thought he was protecting were the source of the leak. His calculation, seeing no one, was fatally flawed. He hadn't accounted for the slave he had saved, or maybe others had seen from a distance. The slave grapevine was clearly more efficient than the prince's intelligence network. In that moment, Moses's entire world collapses. The horror of discovery is twofold. First, the practical, physical fear. If the Hebrews know, it's only a matter of time before an informant tells the Egyptians. And if the Egyptians know, Pharaoh will have him executed. His life is now in immediate danger. But the second level of horror is far deeper, far more existentially crushing. His own people, the ones for whom he risked everything, not only reject his leadership, they mock him for it. They use his secret against him. They don't see him as a hero. They see him as a dangerous, violent hypocrite. He thought his act of violence would unite them behind him. Instead, it alienated them and made them fear him. He had tried to be their savior, and they had cast him in the role of a potential murderer. The brutal lesson here is that you cannot force yourself upon people as their leader. You cannot liberate people who do not want to be led by you. Passion, good intentions, and even personal sacrifice are utterly meaningless if the people you are trying to lead do not trust you. And trust cannot be built with a single, dramatic act of violence. It is built slowly, over time, through relationship, shared struggle, and proven character. Moses had none of that. He was a stranger with a temper. The text says, "Then Moses was afraid." This is a different kind of fear from the panic he felt while hiding the body. That was the fear of a criminal. This is the fear of a failed leader. It's the soul-deep terror that comes from realizing you have completely, utterly, and publicly misread the entire situation. His plan was a disaster. His identity was a sham. He was not the deliverer. He was just a murderer on the run. And of course, the news travels fast. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. The jig was up. The privileged life was over. The bubble had burst. His adoptive family in the palace could not protect him now. He had committed a capital crime, killing an agent of the state. He was now an enemy of the empire that had raised him. He had to run. So he flees. He runs for his life, not as a conquering hero leading a revolution, but as a disgraced and disowned fugitive. He escapes Egypt with nothing but the clothes on his back, leaving behind 40 years of privilege, power, and status. He runs into the desolate wilderness of Midian, a place with no palaces, no libraries, and no armies. He exchanges his royal scepter for a shepherd's staff. The Prince of Egypt, the man trained to command thousands, the man who thought he would be the great liberator of his people, was now a wanted man with no home, no future, and no identity. This is the climax of the first brutal lesson. True leadership doesn't begin when you decide you're ready. It doesn't begin when you come up with a brilliant plan. It doesn't begin when you use your strength and privilege to force a change. Often, it begins in the smoldering ashes of your most spectacular failure. Moses had to be stripped of everything he thought made him a leader. He had to lose his status as a prince. His royal authority was rejected by his own people and made him an enemy of the state. It was a liability, not an asset. He had to lose his reliance on his own strength. His one great act of physical power resulted in murder, fear, and exile. It solved nothing and made everything worse. He had to lose his timeline. He thought the time for liberation was now, because he was ready. He learned in the most painful way possible that his timing was not the right timing. He had to lose his pride. He, a prince of Egypt, was publicly shamed and rejected by 2 common slaves. The humiliation must have been beyond measure. He had to lose his home, his family, and the only life he had ever known. He had to become a nobody, an exile, a man without a country. This is not just a setback. This is a complete demolition of the man. God, in his severe wisdom, allowed Moses' own ego, his own anger, and his own misguided sense of justice to lead him to absolute rock bottom. Why? Because the leader that was needed to save Israel could not be a self-reliant, hot-tempered Egyptian prince who solved problems with secret violence. That man had to die in the desert. A new man had to be born, a man who was humble, a man who was patient, a man who knew, from the deep scars of his own failure, that he could do nothing of lasting value in his own strength. The brutal lesson of Moses' first 40 years is this: your greatest strengths, your highest privileges, and your most passionate plans can become your most catastrophic weaknesses if they are not surrendered to purpose and a timing beyond your own. Before you can lead anyone else, you must be broken of your own self-reliance. Leadership is not about executing your great plan for God. It's about being demolished and then remade into an instrument for His. Moses' journey to leadership didn't begin with a heroic act. It began with a shameful crime, a public humiliation, and a desperate flight into nothingness. It was a baptism by failure. And it was only after he had lost everything that he was finally in a position to begin to learn what true leadership actually was. When a man's world shatters, he runs. He runs from the consequences, from the memory, from the person he used to be. Moses, the fugitive prince, ran east, away from the lush, ordered civilization of the Nile and into the raw, unforgiving emptiness of the desert. The wilderness does not care about your titles or your education. The searing sun is not impressed by your military training, and the barren rocks offer no sympathy for your broken heart. For the first time in his life, Moses was utterly alone and completely insignificant. The identity that had been so carefully constructed for 40 years, prince, scholar, potential commander, was now a dangerous liability, a ghost to be shed in the vast silence. He was no one, heading nowhere. He eventually arrived in the land of Midian, a parched and weary traveler drawn to the one thing that means life in the desert, a well. A well is more than just a source of water. It's a community hub, a place of news, of conflict, and of connection. As he sat, resting his aching body, he witnessed a scene that was both mundane and deeply symbolic. The 7 daughters of Reuel, the priest of Midian, came to draw water for their father's flock. They were capable, hard-working women, filling the heavy stone troughs. But then, as often happens where resources are scarce, bullies arrived. Other shepherds came, and with the casual arrogance of strength, they drove the young women away, intending to water their own flocks from the labor of others. Here, in this dusty, forgotten corner of the world, Moses faced his first test since his catastrophic failure. It was a small-scale reenactment of the very problem he had faced in Egypt, the strong oppressing the weak. What would he do now? The old Moses, the prince driven by rage, might have lashed out with lethal force. The old Moses, reliant on status, might have tried to announce his now non-existent authority. But this was a different man, a man humbled by failure and chastened by fear. He still had his strength, and he still had his innate sense of justice. But this time, something had changed. The Bible says he stood up and saved them. He didn't kill anyone. He didn't fly into a rage. He simply stood up, an act of quiet, resolute authority. He intervened. He drove off the bullying shepherds not with murderous intent, but with controlled power. And then, he did something even more remarkable. He served. He didn't just save them, he then watered their flock. The former prince of Egypt, who had been served his entire life, bent his back to the hard labor of drawing water for someone else's sheep. It was a small act of service, of humility, but it was the first sign of a new heart. It was the first step away from the man who killed to prove a point, and toward the man who would serve to save a people. This act of chivalry and service did not go unnoticed. When the daughters returned home to their father Jethro, also called Reuel, he was surprised at their early return. "How is it that you have come so soon today?" he asked. They explained, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and besides, he drew water for us and watered the flock." Notice, they still see him as an Egyptian. His bearing, his speech, perhaps the tattered remnants of his clothing, all marked him as an outsider. But his actions spoke of a character that Jethro, a wise priest, recognized as valuable. "And where is he?" Jethro exclaimed. "Why have you left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." This was the beginning of Moses' second life. he was invited into the home of a Midianite priest, a man of wisdom and standing in his own community. He was given a place at the table, a place of belonging after being so violently cast out. He found favor with Jethro, and in time, Jethro gave him his daughter, Zipporah, to be his wife. Moses, the fugitive, became a husband. Soon, he became a father to a son he named Gershom, a name heavy with the sorrow of his exile. For he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." Even in this new life, in the comfort of this new family, he felt the deep ache of being an outsider. He was a man betwixt and between, no longer an Egyptian, not yet truly a Midianite. His Hebrew identity, a distant, painful memory. And what was the occupation of this former prince? This man trained in the highest arts of civilization. Jethro was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. He became a shepherd. Let the sheer, brutal humility of that sink in. For the next 40 years, from the age of 40 to the age of 80, Moses' entire world was sheep. His daily companions were not courtiers and military advisors, but stubborn, smelly, simple-minded animals. His grand strategic concerns were not the movement of armies or the administration of a province, but finding the next patch of scrubby grass and the next muddy waterhole. His life, which had been geared towards shaping history, was now dictated by the slow, meandering pace of a flock. This was not a sabbatical. This was not a temporary retreat. This was a 40-year-long demolition of his ego. This was the great unlearning. For every lesson he had learned in the palaces of Egypt, the desert now provided a harsh and silent counter-lesson. In Egypt, he had learned about power. He learned that leadership was about command and control. You give an order and slaves obey. You build monuments through the sheer force of will and the application of whips. In the desert, he learned about guidance. A shepherd does not command a sheep, he leads it. You cannot whip a sheep into finding water where there is none. You cannot command it to be safe from a lurking wolf. A shepherd's power is not in domination, but in wisdom, care, and presence. He has to know the land, anticipate dangers, and provide for the flock's needs. He leads from the front, finding the path, and from the back, protecting the stragglers. The sheep follow him not because they fear him, but because they trust him. For 40 years, Moses practiced this new model of leadership, this servant leadership, on a flock of animals, slowly unlearning the Egyptian model of tyranny. He was learning that a true leader is a provider and a protector, not a taskmaster. In Egypt, he had learned about speed and efficiency. The empire was built on relentless activity, on timetables for construction, on the quick, decisive action of chariots in battle. Moses himself was a man of action, a man whose impatience and rage had led him to commit murder. The desert taught him patience. Sheep do not hurry. They move at their own pace. They stop. They wander. The life of a shepherd is a life of immense, monotonous waiting. Waiting for the flock to graze. Waiting for a ewe to give birth. Waiting for the seasons to change. Waiting for the rain that might never come. For a man like Moses, a man of fire and impulse, this enforced slowness must have been a form of torture at first. He had to slow his mind, his body, and his spirit to the rhythm of the wilderness. He had to learn to sit in silence, to watch, to wait. The rage that had once defined him had no place here. It would only spook the flock and waste precious energy. The desert slowly, relentlessly, baked the impatience out of his soul, replacing it with the deep, enduring patience of a man who understands that nothing worth having comes quickly. In Egypt, he had learned from books and tutors. His knowledge was theoretical, gained from scrolls and intellectual debate. He was a man of the mind, skilled in rhetoric and philosophy. The desert taught him a different kind of knowledge, an embodied wisdom. He learned to read not hieroglyphs, but the sky. He learned to predict the weather from the direction of the wind and the shape of the clouds. He learned to navigate not by maps, but by the stars, the same stars his ancestor Abraham had once looked upon. He learned the practical skills of survival, where to find water, which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to set a broken leg on a lamb, how to fight off a predator with nothing but a wooden staff. This was a raw, practical knowledge that could not be found in any library. It was knowledge gained through calloused hands, a sunburnt face, and weary feet. He was being transformed from an intellectual into a man of the earth, a man whose wisdom was grounded in the harsh realities of life and death. In Egypt, he lived in a world of noise and distraction. The palace was a place of constant human drama, gossip, politics, ceremonies, music, and the endless chatter of courtiers. His mind was always occupied, always stimulated. The desert plunged him into a world of profound silence. For days, weeks on end, the only sounds might be the bleating of sheep, the cry of a hawk, and the whistle of the wind through the canyons. In this silence, a man is forced to confront himself. There are no distractions to hide behind, no titles to puff up his ego, no crowds to affirm his importance. There is only the man and the vast, empty landscape. In this crushing silence, Moses had 40 years to think, 40 years to replay his failure at the hands of the Egyptian, 40 years to ponder the rejection by his own people, 40 years to wrestle with his fractured identity, 40 years to ask the question, who am I really, without my title, my power, my anger? And in that silence, he had 40 years to listen to the quiet whispers of the divine that can only be heard when the noise of the world fades away. The staff in his hand became a powerful symbol of this transformation. In Egypt, he might have carried a ceremonial scepter, a symbol of his royal authority and power to command. Now, his constant companion was a simple shepherd's staff. What is a staff? It is a tool of guidance, used to gently nudge a wandering sheep back to the path. It is a tool of protection, used to ward off predators. It is a tool of support, something to lean on when weary. It is a tool of exploration, used to test the ground ahead. The staff was a symbol not of domination, but of care, protection, and dependence. For 40 years, he learned the feel of that simple piece of wood in his hand until it became an extension of himself. It was the symbol of his new identity, not a prince who takes life, but a shepherd who preserves it. This very same staff would later part the Red Sea, but before it could be an instrument of God's power, it first had to be an instrument of a shepherd's humility for 40 long years. Let's not romanticize this period. The brutal lesson of these 40 years is the lesson of obscurity, of being forgotten. Moses was 40 when he fled Egypt, at the peak of his physical and mental powers. He was trained, he was passionate, he was ready to change the world. And God's response was to send him to the backside of the desert for 4 decades to herd sheep. His grand destiny seemed to have evaporated. The fire for justice that burned in him was reduced to the embers of a lonely campfire under the stars. The world moved on without him. Back in Egypt, the Pharaoh he had known likely died, and a new one rose who did not know him. His people, the Hebrews, continued to suffer, their cries rising to a heaven that seemed silent. And Moses, he was changing diapers, shearing sheep, and growing old. Think of the psychological agony of this. Did he feel like a failure every single day? Did he wonder if he had made a catastrophic mistake, if he had thrown his life away for nothing? Almost certainly. Did he look at his hands, hands that were meant to hold a scepter, and see only the dirt and grime of a shepherd's life, and feel a profound sense of loss? Of course. This is the brutality of God's training ground. It often feels like a graveyard for our ambitions. It feels like we are being wasted, overlooked, forgotten. Moses was put on a shelf for an entire lifetime. He had to watch his youth and middle age fade away in mundane, repetitive, and seemingly unimportant work. This is a lesson that every leader who desires to be used for a great purpose must endure in some form. It is the lesson of the hidden years. Before you can be trusted with the public stage, you must be found faithful in the private wilderness. Before you can lead a nation, you must learn to faithfully lead a flock of sheep when no one is watching. Before you can be trusted with great power, you must learn to live with no power at all. Your character must be forged in the crucible of obscurity. You must learn that your worth is not in what you do, but in who you are becoming. God was not wasting Moses' prime years. He was using them to perform the deep, slow-motion heart surgery that was necessary to save him from himself. The impulsive, arrogant prince had to be painstakingly remade into a humble, patient servant. And that kind of transformation doesn't happen in a weekend seminar. It takes a lifetime. It took 40 years. The time he was 80 years old, the man who stood on the slopes of Mount Horeb was almost unrecognizable from the prince who had fled Egypt. The fire in his eyes had not been extinguished, but it was no longer the wild, consuming fire of rage. It was a controlled, steady flame of quiet strength and deep wisdom. His face was a roadmap of his journey, etched with the lines of the sun, the wind, and 1,000 lonely nights. His body was lean and tough, hardened by decades of walking the wilderness. He no longer walked with the arrogant stride of a prince, but with the sure-footed, patient gait of a shepherd who knows the land. He was no longer trying to force his own destiny. He had likely accepted his quiet life, content to be a husband, a father, and a keeper of his father-in-law's sheep. His ambition was gone, replaced by acceptance. His pride was gone, replaced by humility. His self-reliance was gone, replaced by a quiet dependence on the rhythms of the desert and the God who ruled over it. He had learned the brutal, beautiful lesson of the wilderness, that true strength is found in surrender, true wisdom is found in silence, and true leadership is found in service. He had to be made into a shepherd before he could shepherd a nation. He had to learn to lead a flock of sheep through a desert before he could lead a nation of former slaves through that same desert. The 40 years were not a detour, they were the path. They were not a punishment, they were the preparation. It was the long, slow, painful, and absolutely necessary process of emptying him of Moses so that he could be filled with God. And it was only now, after 40 years of silence and unlearning, after he had finally given up on being the hero of his own story, that he was ready for the story to actually begin. 80 years old. For most, it is an age of quiet reflection, a time to rest weary bones and watch younger generations take the lead. For Moses, it was the age of routine. 40 years, he had walked these same desolate hillsides of Midian, his face a leathered map carved by the sun and wind, his hands gnarled around the smooth, familiar wood of his shepherd's staff. Each day bled into the next, a slow, monotonous rhythm of leading the flock to sparse pasture, finding water, and sitting in the vast, crushing silence of the wilderness. The passionate, angry prince of Egypt was a ghost, a memory from another man's life. The man who now existed was a quiet, humble shepherd, his ambitions long since turned to dust and scattered by the desert winds. He was leading the flock of his father-in-law to the far side of the wilderness, near Horeb, the mountain of God. It was just another Tuesday, but then he saw it, a flicker of something unnatural in the corner of his eye. On the mountainside, a lone acacia bush was engulfed in flames. A bushfire was not unusual in this dry land, but this was different. He paused, shielding his eyes to get a better look. The flames danced and writhed, impossibly bright against the drab landscape. Yet the bush itself was not turning to ash. Its leaves weren't curling and blackening. Its branches weren't cracking and collapsing. The fire was burning with a fierce, clean energy, but the bush was not consumed. It was a paradox, a quiet impossibility that shattered the monotonous reality of his day. The prince scholar that still lived deep inside him was intrigued. The shepherd who knew the ways of the desert was baffled. I will turn aside to see this great sight, he thought, why the bush is not burned. This was the pivot point, a small decision born of curiosity. He could have ignored it, chalked it up to a trick of the heat haze, and kept moving his flock. But he chose to turn aside. He chose to investigate the mystery. And in that moment, his life and the history of the world changed forever. As he drew near, a voice erupted from the heart of the fire, a voice that was not the crackle of flames, but was somehow made of the same awesome power. Moses, Moses, Terror seized him. This was not the voice of a man. It was a voice that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. He froze, every muscle tensed. "Here I am," he managed to whisper, the only response possible in the face of such overwhelming presence. "Do not come any closer," the voice commanded. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Holy ground. This was the same dusty, rock-strewn patch of wilderness he had walked over 100 times. But the presence of this being had transformed it, consecrated it. The act of removing his sandals was an act of profound humility and vulnerability. It was an acknowledgement that he was a mere creature, standing before his Creator. It was a shedding of the last vestiges of his own strength, his own path. Barefoot on the sacred earth, he hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. The man who had once looked Pharaoh in the eye could not bear to gaze upon the source of this voice. Then the voice identified itself, anchoring Moses not in his own failed past, but in the long covenant story of his people. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." This was not some local mountain deity of Midian. This was the God of his ancestors, the God of the promise, the God who had been silent for 430 years, but had not been absent. And then came the reason for this terrifying, awe-inspiring appearance. God spoke of the very people Moses had tried and failed to save 40 years earlier. "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Imagine the flood of emotions in Moses' heart: vindication, relief, joy. The suffering was not unnoticed. The cries were not unheard. God knew. God was going to act. After centuries of bondage, the great deliverance was at hand. But then, the divine declaration took a terrifyingly personal turn. "So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." The silence that followed must have been deafening. The joy in Moses' heart would have instantly turned to ice. "Me, you want me to go?" The 80-year-old shepherd, the forgotten fugitive, the man with a death sentence on his head, the failed revolutionary who was rejected by the very people you want him to save. The request was not just daunting, it was ludicrous. And in his terror and shock, the man who had been silent for 40 years finally found his voice, and it was a voice filled with objections. These objections are not the arguments of an arrogant prince. They are the desperate, honest pleas of a broken man who knows his own inadequacies all too well. This is the brutal lesson of the call. It doesn't come to you when you feel strong and ready, but when you are utterly convinced of your own weakness. His first objection was a cry from the heart of his shattered identity. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" This is the question of a man who has lost all sense of self-worth. 40 years earlier, he knew who he was, a prince of Egypt, strong, educated, capable. Now, he was nothing, a nobody. Who Who am I to confront the most powerful man on earth? I'm an anonymous shepherd. Who am I to lead a nation? I'm a wanted murderer. He was acutely aware of his powerlessness, his insignificance. He had no status, no credentials, no army. It was a perfectly logical and reasonable objection, and God's answer is one of the most profound leadership principles in history. He doesn't argue with Moses' assessment. He doesn't say, "No, Moses, you're not a nobody. You're a great man." He doesn't try to build up Moses' self-esteem. He completely sidesteps the question of Moses' identity and focuses on his own. He says simply, "But I will be with you." The success of the mission would have nothing to do with who Moses was. It had everything to do with who was with him. The brutal lesson for any leader is this: your resume, your qualifications, your strengths, and your weaknesses are all irrelevant. The only question that matters is God with you? The mission is not about your adequacy. It is about his presence. Moses, still reeling, grasps for another objection. He moves from the personal to the theological. If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you," and they ask me, "What is his name?" what shall I say to them? This was a legitimate concern. The Hebrews had been steeped in Egyptian culture for centuries, a culture with a vast pantheon of gods for every conceivable function: Ra the sun god, Anubis the god of the dead, Hapi the god of the Nile. To just say God was vague. They would want specifics. They would want a name, a source of authority. God's answer from the fire is the theological bedrock of the entire Old Testament. God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel: I am has sent me to you." In Hebrew, this is Ayeh Asher Ayeh, connected to the sacred name Yahweh YHWH. This is not a name like Ra or Anubis. It is a statement of absolute, eternal, self-existent being. He is not a God who is dependent on the seasons or the worship of followers. He is not a God who can be captured in an idol or defined by a function. He simply is. He is the source of all being, the uncreated creator. He is telling Moses, "My authority is my very existence. Tell them the one who has always been, is now, and will always be has sent you." The lesson here is that a leader's authority doesn't come from a title or a business card. It comes from being connected to the ultimate, unchanging reality. You are not acting on your own authority, but as an emissary of the great I Am. But Moses is a practical man, and he's not convinced. He shifts from the problem of authority to the problem of credibility. "But behold," he argues, "they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" He has been down this road before. He remembers the sneering face of the Hebrew slave. "Who made you a prince and a judge over us?" He has a history of rejection with these people. Why would this time be any different? He has no proof, just a crazy story about a talking, unburning bush. It's the cry of a leader who fears his message will be rejected. God, in his patience, addresses this practical concern with practical proof. He gives Moses 3 signs. First, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," Moses replies. "Throw it on the ground." Moses does, and the simple shepherd's staff, the symbol of his humble life, writhes into a venomous snake, causing him to flee from it. Then God commands him to do the unthinkable. Put out your hand and catch it by the tail. He does, and it becomes a staff again. The second sign, he is told to put his hand into his cloak. When he pulls it out, it is covered in leprosy, white as snow. He puts it back in, and it's restored. The third sign, when he gets to Egypt, he is to take water from the Nile and pour it on the ground, and it will turn to blood. The lesson is clear. God will not send his leader empty-handed. He will provide the signs, the power, the supernatural confirmation to validate the call. A leader's job is not to generate credibility through his own charisma, but to faithfully use the tools and demonstrate the power that God provides. Even with the promise of God's presence, the revelation of his name, and 3 powerful signs, Moses is still terrified. He makes his 4th objection, and this one is deeply personal, perhaps a lifelong insecurity. "Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue." He's saying, I'm a terrible public speaker. I stumble over my words. I'm not a charismatic orator who can inspire a nation or debate with the scholars in Pharaoh's court. Perhaps he had a stutter. Perhaps he was just awkward and shy after 40 years of talking only to sheep. He is pointing to a genuine, undeniable personal weakness. Surely God had picked the wrong man for a job that would require so much speaking. Here, God's patience begins to wear thin. His response is a sharp, divine rebuke. Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say. This is one of the most brutal and liberating leadership lessons of all. God is not limited by your weaknesses. In fact, he often chooses to work through them so that his power is made more evident. God knew Moses was slow of speech when he called him. He wasn't surprised. The point was never Moses's eloquence. It was God's message. A leader's greatest weakness is not a disqualifier. It is an opportunity for God's strength to be displayed. God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. After all this, the presence, the name, the signs, the promise to overcome his weakness, Moses is stripped of all logical objections. He is left with nothing but raw, honest fear. His final plea is the most pathetic and the most human of all. "Oh, my Lord, please send someone else." This is the cry of a man at the end of his rope. It is the foxhole prayer of a soldier who does not want to go over the top. It's too hard. It's too scary. The risk is too great. The memory of his past failure is too strong. Please, pick anyone else. At this, the text says, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. Yet even in his anger, God shows a measure of grace. He doesn't revoke the call, but he does make a concession. Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall be your spokesman to the people. God provides a partner. He gives the terrified leader a human helper to shore up his weakness. The final brutal lesson of the call is that even when you are kicking and screaming in fearful disobedience, God can be patient, make concessions, and provide help. But He will not let you off the hook. The mission still stands. And so, the reluctant prophet, armed with a staff that turns into a snake, a leper's hand, the name of I Am, and the promise of a brother he hasn't seen in 4 decades, finally submits. He returns to Jethro, makes his excuses, and begins the long journey back to Egypt, the land of his birth, his glory, and his shame. This journey back is the first wobbly step of his new leadership. He is no longer acting on his own initiative, but on a divine command. He meets Aaron in the wilderness, just as God had promised. They go before the elders of Israel. Aaron speaks the words, and Moses performs the signs. And for the first time, something is different. The text says, "The people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel, and that He had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped." The first step is a success. The people are on His side. This must have been a moment of incredible relief for Moses. Maybe this time would be different. Then comes the real test, the confrontation with Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron go into the throne room, a place of immense power and pagan idolatry. Standing before the man who was considered a living God, they deliver the message from Yahweh. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." Pharaoh's reply is filled with all the arrogance and contempt of a world superpower. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey His voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." He doesn't just reject the message, he scoffs at the very existence of the messenger. He dismisses the God of slaves. And then, to prove his power, he does something monstrously cruel. He calls in the taskmasters and gives a new decree. "You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks, as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the number of bricks they make you shall require of them. You shall not diminish it." It was a command designed to break their bodies and their spirits. They now had to do the same amount of work with an impossible new logistical burden. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The people, who had just been worshiping God for His promised deliverance, were now suffering more than ever before. The Egyptian taskmasters beat the Hebrew foremen, who in turn turned their anger and despair not on Pharaoh, but on Moses and Aaron. They confronted them, saying, "The Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." This is the agonizing reality of leadership. Moses' first great act of obedience to God's specific command did not lead to victory. It led to a massive backlash that made life infinitely worse for the very people he was sent to save. They now hated him for it. He had taken them from a state of chronic suffering and plunged them into a state of acute crisis. The people who were celebrating him days earlier were now cursing him. The weight of this failure crushes Moses. He goes back to God, his faith shattered, his voice filled with the anguish of a leader who feels betrayed by the one who sent him. His prayer is not respectful. It is a raw accusation. "O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have done nothing to deliver them." This is the brutal truth that every leader must face. Answering the call is terrifying, but the first steps of obedience can be even worse. They can lead to increased opposition, apparent failure, and the rejection of those you are trying to help. It is in this moment of despair, when the mission seems to be a disaster, and both your enemies and your followers have turned against you, that a leader is truly forged. It requires a faith that goes beyond immediate results, a trust in the caller that perseveres even when all the evidence screams that you have made a terrible mistake. Moses had confronted earthly power with only a staff and a promise, and the immediate result was a catastrophe. He had to learn that God's deliverance rarely follows a straight line, and the path to the promised land often leads through a much darker valley first. There are moments in a leader's journey that feel like pure, unadulterated triumph. Moments so spectacular, so divinely orchestrated, that they seem to validate every struggle and silence every doubt. For Moses, that moment came on the shores of the Red Sea. Behind him lay the drowned carcasses of Pharaoh's chariots, the final gurgling gasp of the mightiest army on earth. Before him, stretching towards the horizon, was the path to freedom, and all around him, an entire nation of newly freed slaves, men, women, and children, 2 million strong, was singing. His sister Miriam led the women in a dance, their voices rising in ecstatic praise. "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." In that moment, Moses was more than a leader. He was a hero, a deliverer, the undisputed agent of God's miraculous power. The 10 plagues, the Passover, the pillar of cloud and fire, the impossible parting of the waters. It was a string of victories on a scale the world had never seen. The people didn't just follow him, they revered him. The doubts and fears that had plagued him at the burning bush must have seemed a distant memory. The mission was a resounding success. The hardest part was surely over. Now, it was just a short walk to the promised land. This is the beautiful, dangerous honeymoon phase of leadership. It's the period after the big win, the successful product launch, the revolutionary breakthrough. It's a time of unity, celebration, and boundless optimism. And it is almost always painfully short-lived. For Moses and the Israelites, it lasted exactly 3 days. 3 days they journeyed from the Red Sea into the wilderness of Shur, and they found no water. The elation of their miraculous deliverance quickly evaporated under the relentless heat of the desert sun. The songs of praise died in their parched throats. The children began to cry. The elderly grew weak. The optimism curdled into anxiety, and the anxiety quickly festered into resentment. When they finally came to a place called Marah, they found water, and for a moment, their hopes surged. But when they tasted it, it was bitter, undrinkable, and the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" This is the first instance of a word that will come to define the next 40 years of Moses' life. grumbling. It wasn't a polite inquiry. It was an accusation. The tone was not, "Moses, our wise leader, what should we do?" It was, "You got us into this mess. Now what are you going to do about it?" Notice, they didn't cry out to God, who had just saved them 3 days prior. They turned on his appointed leader. In that moment, the hero of the Red Sea became the scapegoat of Mara. This incident set the brutal, soul-crushing pattern that would repeat itself endlessly for the next 4 decades. It's a 4-step cycle that every leader of a difficult, long-term project will recognize. Step 1. The people encounter a problem: thirst, hunger, fear. Step 2. They forget all past victories and panic. Step 3. They blame the leader. Step 4. The leader is forced to turn to God for a solution, bearing the full weight of his people's anger and his own exhaustion. Moses cried out to the Lord, who showed him a log. Moses threw the log into the bitter water, and it became sweet. A miracle. The immediate crisis was averted, but the deeper, more corrosive problem had been revealed. The people had the bodies of free men, but they still had the hearts of slaves. A slave mentality is defined by dependence and complaint. In Egypt, when a problem arose, they complained to the taskmaster. Now, in the wilderness, Moses was the new taskmaster. They had not yet learned to be a free people, responsible for their own faith and their own relationship with God. They were a nation of toddlers, and Moses was the perpetually exhausted parent. Soon after, the food they had brought from Egypt ran out. The reality of their new life set in. There were no Egyptian food rations here, no guaranteed meals. There was just sand and sky. And the grumbling began again, this time from the whole congregation. But this time, it was worse. They didn't just complain about the present. They began to romanticize the past. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, they wailed, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. This is one of the most brutal lessons of leadership. People will often prefer the memory of a comfortable slavery to the reality of an uncomfortable freedom. They had forgotten the whips, the forced labor, the murdered children. Their memory, clouded by the discomfort of their empty stomachs, had selectively edited their past, turning the house of bondage into a land of nostalgic plenty. And again, the blame was squarely on Moses. You have brought us out here to kill us. They saw him not as a liberator, but as the architect of their demise. Once more, Moses and Aaron took the complaint to God, who responded with a promise of supernatural provision. I will rain bread from heaven for you. And so began the miracle of manna, a strange, wafer-like substance that appeared on the ground with the morning dew every day for 40 years. It was a lesson in daily dependence. They couldn't hoard it, it would rot. They could only gather what they needed for that day. It was a physical manifestation of the prayer, give us this day our daily bread. To supplement this, God also sent flocks of quail that settled in the camp, providing them with meat. God had met their bitter complaint with sweet provision. But did it solve the problem of their hearts? Not for long. They came to a place called Rephidim, and again there was no water. The grumbling escalated to a new level of intensity. The Bible says the people quarreled with Moses. This was not just complaining. It was an angry, aggressive confrontation. And their accusation became even more pointed. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? They were so enraged, so consumed by their fear, that they were ready to kill him. They were almost ready to stone me. Moses cried out to God. Imagine the immense loneliness and terror of that position. Moses is standing before 2 million desperate, thirsty people who are holding rocks in their hands and looking at him with murder in their eyes. The very people he had sacrificed everything for, the people he had led out of slavery, were now his potential executioners. This is the crushing weight of leadership. When people are afraid, they look for someone to blame, and the person at the front is the biggest target. God instructs Moses to take his staff, the same staff that had parted the sea, and strike a specific rock at Horeb. Moses obeys, and in front of the elders of Israel, water gushes forth from the solid rock, enough for the entire nation. Another crisis, another miracle. But the scars on Moses' soul must have been deepening with each episode. He was learning the hard way that leading God's people was a far more dangerous and thankless task than confronting Pharaoh. Pharaoh was an external enemy. This was a war from within. Just as the thirst crisis ended, a new threat emerged. An external enemy. The Amalekites, a fierce tribe of desert nomads, attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. For the first time, Israel had to be a nation at war. Moses' role in this battle is a profound lesson in a different kind of leadership. He doesn't strap on a sword and lead the charge. He's 80 years old, and his skills are no longer those of a warrior. He appoints a younger man, Joshua, to lead the army. Moses' battlefield is not in the valley. It's on the top of a nearby hill. He went up the hill with his staff, and a strange thing began to happen. As long as Moses held up his hand, holding the staff of God, Joshua and the Israelites prevailed in the battle below. But Moses was an old man. His arms grew tired, and when he lowered his hands, the Amalekites began to win. The fate of the entire nation, the outcome of their first ever war, rested on the endurance of their aging leader's arms. This is a brutal illustration of the physical and spiritual weariness of leadership. A leader's intercession, their vision, their spiritual resolve, is the unseen force that empowers the people on the front lines. But the leader is human. They get tired. Their arms get heavy. And when their strength fails, the entire enterprise is at risk. Moses couldn't do it alone. So his brother Aaron and another man named Hur came and stood on either side of him. They put a stone under him to sit on, and each of them took one of his arms and held them up steady until the sun set. And because of this act of supportive leadership, Joshua won a decisive victory. The lesson is painfully clear. No leader, not even one as great as Moses, can sustain the burden alone. Without a support system, without people to metaphorically, and in this case, literally, hold up your arms, you will fail. Burnout is not a maybe. It is a mathematical certainty for the unsupported leader. The greatest test, however, was yet to come. The nation arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai, the very place where God had first appeared to Moses in the burning bush. Here, God would make a covenant with his people and give them his law, the blueprint for their new life as a free nation. The scene was one of terrifying majesty. The mountain was wrapped in a thick cloud of smoke and fire, shaking with thunder and the blast of a supernatural trumpet. The people trembled in fear. Moses alone went up into the presence of God. For 40 days and 40 nights, he was on the mountain, receiving the 10 Commandments, inscribed by the finger of God on 2 tablets of stone, along with the intricate civil and ceremonial laws that would govern Israel. He was in a state of direct, unmediated communion with the Almighty. But while Moses was on the mountain having a spiritual peak experience, the people down in the valley were descending into chaos. 40 days is a long time to wait. In the absence of their leader, the people grew restless, then fearful. Where was Moses? Had the mountain consumed him? Had this terrifying God killed him? Their fragile faith, so dependent on the visible presence of their human leader, began to crumble. They reverted to what they knew, to the religious practices of Egypt. They went to Aaron, the second in command, and made a demand. Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Aaron, in a moment of catastrophic weakness, caved to the pressure. He told them to bring their gold earrings, and he fashioned them into a golden calf, a common idol form from Egypt. And the people looked at this lifeless statue and declared, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." They built an altar, offered sacrifices, and then the feast to the Lord devolved into a drunken, pagan orgy. They had taken their freedom, and at the first opportunity, had used it to return to the idolatry of their bondage. It was a complete and utter betrayal of God, of Moses, and of the entire purpose of their liberation. Up on the mountain, God saw it all, and his wrath was incandescent. "Go down," he told Moses, "for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves." God's judgment was swift and total. "Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. And of you I will make a great nation." This was the ultimate test of Moses' leadership. God offered him a deal. "Stand aside, let me wipe the slate clean, and I will make you the new Abraham. Your legacy will be secure. You won't have to deal with these stiff-necked, ungrateful people anymore." It was a tempting offer, but Moses' response in this moment is perhaps the single greatest act of leadership in his entire life. He doesn't accept the offer. He doesn't think of his own legacy. He thinks of the people, and he thinks of God's reputation. He stands in the gap and intercedes. He argues with God. He reminds God of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He appeals to God's own character and reputation among the nations. Why should the Egyptians say, "With evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains"? He is so identified with his rebellious people that he makes this astonishing plea. "But now, if if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. He would rather be damned himself than see his people destroyed and God's name dishonored. He was willing to sacrifice his own soul for the flock he had been given. God relented, but Moses' trial was not over. He came down the mountain carrying the stone tablets, and when he saw the scene of debauchery with his own eyes, a righteous fury overtook him. This was not the impulsive, self-serving rage of his youth when he killed the Egyptian. This was the holy anger of a leader who saw the covenant he had just received being trampled underfoot. In a powerfully symbolic act, he threw the sacred tablets to the ground, shattering them at the foot of the mountain. His actions screamed, "You have broken this covenant before it even began." He then seized the golden calf, burned it in the fire, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. He forced them to ingest the physical evidence of their own sin, to feel the grit of their idolatry in their throats. It was a brutal, visceral act of prophetic judgment. He then called out, "Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me." The tribe of Levi, his own tribe, rallied to him, and he gave them a terrible command to go through the camp and kill the ringleaders of the rebellion, even their own brothers, friends, and neighbors. That day, about 3,000 men died. This is the horrifying, brutal side of leadership. Sometimes, to save the nation, the cancer of rebellion must be cut out with a sword. The aftermath was a period of slow, painful rebuilding, but the challenges of leadership continued. Moses was now the sole judge for a nation of 2 million. People lined up from morning until night with their disputes, and he was single-handedly trying to solve every problem. His father-in-law, Jethro, came for a visit and was appalled at what he saw. "What you are doing is not good," the wise old priest told him. "You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone." Jethro then gave Moses a masterclass in delegation. Appoint trustworthy men as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Let them handle the smaller disputes and only bring the most difficult cases to you. It was a simple, practical lesson in organizational structure, but it was vital. The brutal lesson is that divine calling does not negate the need for common sense and good management. A leader who tries to be the answer to every problem will become the bottleneck for every solution and will ultimately destroy himself. The final, heartbreaking episode of this era of rebellion came at Kadesh Barnea, on the very border of the Promised Land. The journey was almost over. Moses sent 12 spies, one from each tribe, to scout out the land. After 40 days, they returned. They all agreed that the land was magnificent, flowing with milk and honey. But then, 10 of the spies gave a report of fear. "The people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. We seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." Their report of fear, like a virus, infected the entire congregation. Only 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, gave a report of faith. "Let us go up at once and occupy it," they urged, "for we are well able to overcome it." But the people chose to listen to the 10 voices of fear over the 2 voices of faith. The whole congregation lifted up their voices and wept all night. They grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and once again the old refrain returned. "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." This was the point of no return. After all the miracles, all the provision, all the guidance, their hearts were still those of fearful slaves. They stood at the doorway of their destiny and chose to turn back. God's judgment was final and heartbreaking. The 10 faithless spies were struck down by a plague, and the entire generation of adults who had come out of Egypt, everyone 20 years old and upward, was sentenced to die in the wilderness. They would wander for 40 years. 1 year for each day the spies were in the land, until every last one of them had fallen. Their children, the very ones they claimed they were trying to protect, would be the ones to enter the land. Imagine the crushing weight of that verdict on Moses. He had successfully led his people out of bondage, but he had failed to lead the bondage out of his people. He was now sentenced to lead a walking funeral procession for the next 38 years. His job was to manage the slow, meandering death of an entire generation, including his own friends and family. This is the ultimate brutal lesson of the wilderness. A leader can, and often must, continue to lead and serve a people who, through their own rebellion and fear, have forfeited their own destiny. His job was not just to guide them, but to preside over the long, tragic consequences of their greatest failure. The promised land was in sight, but for them, and for him, it was now a lifetime away. The final years of the wilderness wandering were different. The fiery, dramatic rebellions that had marked the early journey faded, replaced by the slow, quiet rhythm of a generation passing away. For 38 years after the catastrophic verdict at Kadesh Barnea, the nation of Israel was a nomadic funeral procession. The men and women who had come out of Egypt, the ones who had seen the plagues and walked through the Red Sea, but whose hearts were still shackled to slavery. One by one, they grew old, and their bodies were returned to the desert sand. Their grumbling was silenced by the grave. In their place, a new generation arose. This was a generation born in freedom, or at least in the harsh, disciplined freedom of the wilderness. They had never known the lash of an Egyptian taskmaster. They had never bowed to an idol of gold. Their daily reality was the pillar of cloud and fire. Their daily bread was the manna that appeared with the dew. Their law was the law given at Sinai. Their leader was Moses. They were a tougher, leaner, more resilient people, forged in the crucible of the desert. And as the 40th year of the journey drew to a close, they stood once again on the borders of the promised land. The end was in sight. The long exile was almost over, and for Moses, now 120 years old, the finish line of his life's great marathon was just ahead. He had survived it all, the rejection, the complaints, the threats of stoning, the betrayal of the golden calf, the heartbreak of Kadesh Barnea. He had shepherded this stiff-necked people with a patience that was nothing short of superhuman. He had been worn down, but he had not been broken. He had persevered, and now he was on the cusp of completing his mission. Then they came to the wilderness of Zin, to a place called Kadesh, and there was no water. It was the same old problem, the same old crisis, but this time it was the new generation, the children of the complainers, who took up the familiar, bitter refrain. They assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron and quarreled with them, their words an eerie echo of their parents' long-silenced complaints. Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, for us and our livestock to die here? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? For Moses, this must have been the cruelest imaginable déjà vu. After 40 years of patient leadership, after burying an entire generation of rebels, here were their children, standing in the same spot, spouting the same faithless poison. The generational cycle of ingratitude was starting all over again. And in that moment, something inside the old leader, something that had endured for 4 decades, finally snapped. He and Aaron went to the tent of meeting and fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. God's instruction was simple and clear, a test of faith and obedience designed for a weary leader. Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. The command was precise. The miracle this time was not to be wrought by an act of power, but by an act of speech. He was to demonstrate to this new generation that the power was in God's word, not in Moses' might. He was to sanctify God, to set him apart as holy and gracious. Moses took the staff, just as God commanded. He and Aaron gathered the people before the rock, but the man who stood before them was not the calm, controlled intercessor. He was a man pushed beyond his limits, his face a mask of righteous fury and 40 years of pent-up frustration. He looked out at the sea of complaining faces, and the words that came out of his mouth were not words of faith, but of bitter exasperation. "Hear now, you rebels," he snarled. The term was accurate, but the tone was one of contempt. And then he said the fatal words, "Shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" We, in that single, arrogant pronoun, Moses and Aaron put themselves in the place of God. For a fleeting moment, they took the credit. They made the miracle about their power, their ability to provide for these ungrateful rebels. It was a subtle but profound act of self-exaltation. And then, compounding the sin, Moses directly disobeyed God's clear command. He didn't speak to the rock. His anger was too great. He needed a physical release. He lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. The tragic irony is that the miracle still happened. Water gushed out in abundance, and the people and their livestock drank. God, in his grace, would not let the people die of thirst because of their leader's failure. He provided for them, but he would not let his leader's sin go unpunished. The judgment was immediate, swift, and utterly devastating. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." Just like that, it was over. With one act of angry disobedience, one moment of arrogant speech, Moses forfeited the dream of a lifetime. The man who had given everything to lead his people to the promised land was now barred from entering it himself. The sin was not just striking the rock, it was the public misrepresentation of God. Before a generation that needed to see the holiness and grace of Yahweh, Moses had presented him as angry and vindictive, a reflection of his own weary heart. Leaders are held to a higher standard because they are representatives. And Moses, in his moment of greatest weakness, had misrepresented the one he was sent to represent. This is perhaps the most brutal leadership lesson of all. A leader is most vulnerable to catastrophic failure, not at the beginning of the journey, but near the very end. It is the cumulative weariness, the long-term exposure to criticism and ingratitude that can erode the soul and lead to a single, fatal lapse in judgment. 40 years of faithfulness can be undone by one moment of frustration-fueled disobedience. The agony of this verdict is almost impossible to comprehend. But what followed is a testament to the true greatness of Moses' character. He had been given a personal death sentence for his dream, but his mission was not yet complete. He had to get up the next day, and the day after that, and continue to lead. He had to swallow his own heartbreak and focus on preparing his people for a future he would not share. This is the quiet, painful heroism of a true leader. His final days were a flurry of activity, a masterclass in finishing well despite profound personal disappointment. He led the people in their final military campaigns. He dealt with one last rebellion and one last plague of fiery serpents, instructing the people to look upon a bronze serpent on a pole to be healed, a strange and powerful foreshadowing of a future salvation. He mourned the death of his brother Aaron, his partner in ministry for 40 years, who also died on a mountain, barred from the promised land for the same sin. And most importantly, he prepared his successor. There seems to be no trace of bitterness or jealousy as he publicly commissions Joshua. He lays his hands on the younger man, transferring his authority and spirit, empowering him for the task ahead. A great leader's final task is to ensure the mission succeeds after they are gone. Moses did this with grace and dignity, cheering on the man who would get to complete the journey he had started. His final act was to gather the entire nation on the plains of Moab, with the Jordan River and the hills of Canaan visible in the distance, and deliver a series of farewell speeches that form the book of Deuteronomy. This book is the outpouring of a leader's heart at the end of his life. With a desperate, passionate love, he retells their history, reminding the new generation of God's faithfulness and their parents' failures. He restates the law, grounding them once more in the covenant, and he pleads with them, exhorts them, and blesses them, pouring out every last drop of his wisdom and experience. I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse, he cries in his final sermon. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live. He finished his work. He had prepared the people. He had appointed a new leader. His mission was complete. Then came the final personal command from God. Go up this mountain of the Abarim, Mount Nebo, and view the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel for a possession, and die on the mountain which you ascend. So the old man, 120 years old, his eyes still sharp and his strength undiminished, made his last journey. He ascended Mount Nebo alone, and from the summit, God gave him one last, bittersweet gift. The Bible says the Lord showed him the whole land in a breathtaking, panoramic vision. He saw the rolling hills of Gilead, the distant lands of Naphtali and Dan, the territories of Ephraim and Manasseh, the future kingdom of Judah stretching to the Mediterranean Sea, the dry expanse of the Negev, and the lush green circle of the plain of Jericho, the city of palm trees. He saw it all, the land of the promise, the land flowing with milk and honey, the goal of 40 years of struggle, the home he had dreamed of for his people. He saw his life's work laid out before him, a beautiful, tangible reality. He could see it, but he could not set foot in it. Can we even imagine the complex storm of emotions in that moment, the profound joy that his people had finally made it, the deep satisfaction of a mission accomplished, and the sharp, personal agony of a dream denied? It is the ultimate lesson for a leader. The mission is greater than you. Its success is the true reward, even if you don't get to personally enjoy the fruits of your labor. Your calling is to get the people to the destination, not to secure your own place there. And there, on that lonely mountain, in the sight of the promised land, Moses, the servant of the Lord, died, according to the word of the Lord. The text adds a final, intimate, and mysterious detail. And he, the Lord, buried him in the valley, in the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. He died alone with God, and he was buried by God, a final act of tender care for his faithful, flawed servant. The final words of the Torah serve as his epitaph, a testament to his unparalleled place in history. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, and to all his servants, and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. His life was a brutal, beautiful epic of leadership. He was born a slave and raised a prince, and had to be demolished to be remade as a prophet. He learned that passion without patience is destructive. He learned in 40 years of silent obscurity that a leader must be a servant first. He learned that answering the call means facing down your deepest fears and insecurities. He learned the thankless, grueling reality of leading an ungrateful people, of bearing their complaints and interceding for them even when they betrayed him. And finally, he learned the painful price of a moment's weakness and the profound, bittersweet truth that a leader's ultimate purpose is to fulfill a mission they may not personally complete. The greatness of Moses is not found in his perfection, but in his perseverance. He was a man of great passion and great flaws, a man who argued with God, who despaired, who got angry, who failed. But through it all, for 120 years, he kept showing up. He kept seeking God's face. He kept loving his people. And he finished his task. His story is not a fairy tale. It is a raw, honest, and deeply human portrait of what it truly costs to lead. It's a reminder that the path of a great leader is not a steady ascent to glory, but a long, often painful journey of being broken, humbled, and ultimately used for a purpose far greater than oneself.